Imagine an entertainment studio, right? But it's operating out of this abandoned office building.
Right.
And they are shooting 15 script pages a single day. There's no unions involved, no A-list stars demanding, like, luxury trailers. And the crazy part is the episodes they produce last exactly 60 seconds.
Which is just wild to think about.
It really is. But now, imagine that this incredibly scrappy, raw production model is absolutely terrifying the billion-dollar legacy studios of Hollywood.
Oh, for sure.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, our mission is to unpack this highly critical, fairly controversial analysis of Hollywood's current unemployment and financial crisis.
Yeah, it's a big one.
The core thesis we are exploring today presents a really heavy claim that Hollywood's rapid contraction is entirely self-inflicted. The argument is that this crisis is driven by, well, a toxic combination of ideological casting, totally bloated budgets, and an open, almost active hostility toward their core audience.
Yeah, and before we get into the actual mechanics of how this is allegedly happening, I do need to set a very clear framework for our discussion today.
Right, absolutely.
Because the worldview we are unpacking today contains highly polarized, very politically charged arguments, specifically regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, as well as, gender politics and entertainment.
Which is obviously a very heated topic.
Exactly. So it is crucial to state right at the top that neither of us is endorsing, validating, or condemning these claims. Our goal today is strictly impartial.
We're just looking at the math of the claims, yeah.
Right. We are here to objectively map out the perspective being presented in this critique, to understand its underlying thesis, and to dissect the structural arguments it's making about the entertainment industry.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before looking at any of the cultural arguments, this thesis insists we have to examine the cold, hard math.
You always have to start with the math.
Right. Why is the entertainment industry bleeding so much cash right now? And the foundational argument introduces this concept called streamflation.
Streamflation.
You've probably felt this in your own wallet, honestly. Prices are accelerating across platforms like Netflix, Disney, Max, but the user experience is actually degrading.
Yeah, the mechanics of streamflation are just deeply frustrating for the consumer because it isn't just about a monthly subscription going up by $2. It's about structural degradation of the product itself.
Like losing features.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Streaming services are actively removing features, taking away 4K resolution from certain tiers and locking it behind a premium paywall.
Which is so annoying.
Or they are introducing unskippable ads into tiers that, used to be ad-free. So you are fundamentally paying more money for an inferior product.
Yeah.
And when consumers face that kind of squeeze, the immediate psychological response is consolidation. They look at their bill and say, okay, I'm canceling 3 services and keeping 1.
Which creates a massive revenue crater on the distribution side. But the analysis goes further, pointing out that this contraction is equally severe on the production side, too.
Oh, absolutely. The production ecosystem is shrinking rapidly right now. Fewer movies and television shows are being greenlit across the board. And a massive underlying factor here is international distribution.
Right, the global market.
Yeah. For the last 2 decades, Hollywood could really rely on international markets, particularly massive ones like China, as a safety net.
Like a bailout.
Exactly. If a bloated $200 million blockbuster completely underperformed in the United States, global box office receipts would often just bail it out.
But that's changing now.
Right. This thesis highlights that those international markets are increasingly shutting Hollywood out, either due to regulatory pushback from foreign governments or simply, and this is key, a lack of interest in the narratives being exported.
And without that global safety net, the geographic and regulatory costs of operating in the United States become, glaringly obvious.
Oh, yeah.
The argument points heavily at states like California, suggesting that high taxes and deeply entrenched union rules make lower-budget productions financially unviable. The barrier to entry is so high that small, independent films just can't afford to get off the ground there.
Which forces everyone to look elsewhere.
Right, you constantly hear about other states or even other countries spending billions of dollars in tax incentives to court Hollywood productions. But from this perspective, those incentives are basically a mirage, Right?
Yeah, the argument frames it as an economic illusion. Throwing tax dollars at a film production doesn't actually create a stable, long-term local industry unless a robust network already exists.
Like post-production houses, agencies.
Exactly, sound stages like you see in New York or the UK. Without that permanent infrastructure already in place, the circus just comes to
A
town.
circus. Yeah, I like that.
The production drops in, utilizes the tax breaks, employs some local caterers and drivers for maybe 3 months, and then packs up and takes all the intellectual property and long-term revenue right back to Los Angeles.
You know, it really reminds me of a bloated tech startup during the zero interest rate era.
Oh, that's a good comparison.
Think of those companies that overhired massively when venture capital was basically free money. They built these lavish corporate campuses, hired thousands of middle managers.
The classic tech bloat, yeah.
Right. And then when the market turned and money got expensive, they suddenly had to lay off huge swaths of their workforce. And what did? They blamed it all on AI.
Right.
This analysis makes the exact same point about Hollywood using artificial intelligence as a scapegoat for all these job losses. AI isn't actually displacing these jobs yet. It's just changing the workflow. The real reason for the layoffs is that the industry completely overextended itself.
And that historical bloat is fatal when your margins collapse. I mean, for decades, the entertainment industry operated with massive excesses of cash.
Yeah, just throwing money around.
Because there was always another guaranteed box office hit around the corner, or another wave of streaming subscribers to impress Wall Street. And because of that padding, the argument goes, the industry never had to learn how to operate like a lean, efficient private business.
A bubble burst.
Exactly. Now that the bubble has burst, the bloat is fatal.
So, if the traditional model is bleeding cash and budgets are impossibly high, that creates a glaring question. Why aren't the movies making enough money to cover those budgets?
Which brings us to the core cultural critique.
Right. This brings us to the central cultural claim of the thesis. The argument asserts that Hollywood has actively prioritized ideology and identity politics over its actual target demographic.
And the critique assigns a massive financial penalty to this shift. It argues that this hyper-focus on identity is costing Hollywood literally hundreds of billions of dollars.
Right, hundreds of billions.
That's the claim, yeah. The mathematical logic presented here is rooted strictly in demographics. For example, the argument cites that Black people make up about 13% of the U.S. population and roughly 3% of the U.K. population.
Okay.
So the underlying thesis is that if a studio's primary fiduciary responsibility is to generate profit,
which it is for a business.
Right. Then alienating the majority demographic to over-index on a minority demographic is just a catastrophic business strategy.
Let's look at the actual storytelling mechanics of that, because the critique extends this logic into how narratives are actually built. It argues that ideological priorities are breaking foundational screenwriting rules.
Yeah, this part is really interesting structurally.
They use the animated superhero series Invincible as a prime example here. They specifically point to the gender swapping of a character named Zoe. Because in the original comic, the character was male, and the adaptation changed the character to a female.
Right. And to understand the critique here, we have to look at how structural screenwriting actually works. In traditional narrative design, side characters are essentially load-bearing walls for the protagonist's character arc.
Okay, load-bearing walls.
Yeah, they exist to serve a specific plot function, to act as a foil, or to highlight a specific strength or flaw in the main character.
So they aren't just like random people existing in a world. They are tools designed to push the protagonist's story forward.
Precisely. So if a writer alters a side character's gender, background, or core identity solely to satisfy a real-world diversity metric...
Without rebuilding the whole story.
Exactly. Without rebuilding the surrounding narrative scaffolding to account for how that change affects the protagonist, the internal logic of the story collapses. The argument is that prioritizing a real-world quota over the internal utility of the script breaks the immersion for the audience.
And audiences intuitively feel that structural weakness, right?
Yes.
Even if they aren't trained screenwriters, they know when something feels off.
Oh, definitely.
Which brings us to the massive decline in anticipation for legacy franchises.
Yeah.
Look at Star Wars. According to this worldview, new Star Wars movies aren't even cracking Fandango's top 10 most anticipated lists anymore.
Which would have been unthinkable a decade ago.
Totally unthinkable. And the critique heavily criticizes the franchise's reliance on what it terms the Baby Yoda grift.
The Baby Yoda grift.
Yeah, the argument is that the studios are using these incredibly cute, highly merchandising-friendly elements to basically distract the audience from a rapidly deteriorating core narrative.
What's fascinating here is how that phrase, the Baby Yoda grift, really highlights how this perspective views the transactional nature of entertainment.
How so?
Well, it argues that historically, Hollywood was based on a very clear, objective understanding of professional competence. You pay for a ticket, we provide a compelling, well-structured story. It was a pure transaction.
I do want to push back on something here, though, just to make sure we are thoroughly examining the underlying logic, because the language used in this thesis can be incredibly harsh. At multiple points, it refers to actors merely as products or objects meant for audience consumption. It's framing them basically as tools on a screen.
Yeah, it's very blunt.
It sounds incredibly dehumanizing, honestly. What is the actual business logic for framing human beings and artists that way?
It's a fair point to challenge, absolutely, and it requires looking at a very specific traditional definition of professionalism within commercial art.
Okay.
From this perspective, the output on the screen, the performance itself, is the product being purchased by the consumer. It is distinctly separate from the human being playing the role. The critique argues that modern creators and actors have fundamentally conflated objective criticism of that product with personal attacks on their identity.
Wait, so if an audience rejects a poorly written character or just a wooden performance, they are simply rejecting a defective product they paid for. But the studio perceives that rejection as bigotry.
That is the absolute core of the argument. Because the industry is allegedly so wrapped up in identity politics, creators take market rejection as a moral failing on the part of the audience, rather than a market signal that their product is flawed.
Wow. And if they view the audience's rejection as a moral failing, they have no incentive to fix the script.
Exactly.
They just blame the customer. Which leads into arguably the most aggressive structural flaw identified in this thesis. It's bad enough to manufacture a product people don't want to buy, but the critique claims Hollywood takes it a step further by actively antagonizing and attacking the consumers who refuse to consume it.
Yeah, the analysis points to a fundamental disconnect between the creator and the consumer today. It argues that many modern showrunners and writers view themselves primarily as elevated artists, intellectuals who are morally superior to their audience.
Right.
Consequently, they view the audience's actual desires, things like foundational genre tropes, pure escapism, or just straightforward heroism as mere slop.
Slop. That's so condescending.
It is, and we see some stark, contrasting examples brought up to illustrate this divide. Take the author Andy Weir, who wrote The Martian.
Oh, I love The Martian.
Yeah, great book. The thesis highlights how Weir has explicitly stated that he puts absolutely no political messaging or hidden symbolism in his stories. He just wants to write thrilling, pure entertainment based on science.
Just a good story.
Right. And yet, the claim is that Weir was actively attacked by certain cultural critics specifically for doing that, for refusing to insert a political message into his work.
On the flip side of that coin, the perspective contrasts Weir with Robert Picardo, an actor involved in the upcoming Starfleet Academy series.
Yeah, this is a wild example.
The critique points out how Picardo proudly told franchise fans that if they disagree with his political perspectives, they can essentially fall by the roadside. He openly boasted about blocking fans he deemed stupid.
Which violates what this thesis calls the golden rule of the internet.
Right. You're not smarter than the internet. It's just a baffling dynamic to observe. Does the entertainment industry truly believe it can scold its audience into submission?
Apparently so.
Do executives think that if they insult the fans enough, the fans will suddenly apologize and renew their Disney Plus subscriptions? Or is it that these creators are just trapped in such an impenetrable echo chamber that they genuinely don't understand why the outside world is rejecting their work?
The worldview we are unpacking strongly suggests it is an echo chamber. And it uses this biological metaphor to describe the mechanism keeping it intact, an antibody response.
An antibody response.
Yeah. The argument is that Hollywood currently operates as a strict ideological monoculture. Only one acceptable set of opinions is allowed in the writer's room or the boardroom.
So no dissenting voices.
Zero. If an executive were to stand up and suggest that, hey, perhaps they should stop insulting the fan base, or perhaps they should focus on broad commercial appeal and traditional narrative structures, that executive would be treated as a foreign virus. The system's antibodies would immediately attack and purge them.
That is a terrifying environment for innovation.
Yeah.
It's not just the cliche of steering a ship into an iceberg. It's more like a legacy retail brand. Think of a Blockbuster or a Sears in the late 90s.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
They saw the internet coming. They saw consumer habits shifting toward convenience. And instead of adapting, they just insulated themselves. They decided the consumer was wrong. And because of that monoculture, the very people who actually understand how to fix the financial crisis are too afraid to speak up, guaranteeing the industry will keep bleeding money.
Which brings us to the ultimate free market reality check. If legacy studios are bleeding cash and alienating fans, that creates a massive vacuum. The demand for engaging stories hasn't disappeared.
People still want to be entertained.
Exactly. Human beings still want to be entertained, so where are their eyeballs actually going?
And this is where the deep dive takes a truly fascinating forward-looking turn. If you want to see the exact opposite of Hollywood's current bloated, insulated model, you look at the absolute explosion of the microdrama industry.
The financial projections here are just staggering.
I couldn't believe it when I read it.
The thesis points out that the microdrama industry is estimated to be worth $11 billion by the year 2025.
$11 billion. And for anyone who hasn't encountered these yet, the format is wild. These are incredibly condensed, stripped-down narrative arcs, usually lasting about 1 minute per episode.
Just 60 seconds.
Yeah, and they are delivered directly to your smartphone, and they rely entirely on pure plot, high emotion, and instant gratification.
We really need to look at the behavioral psychology and the economics of how these microdramas function, too.
Yeah.
Because they don't monetize through a flat $15 monthly subscription.
No, it's completely different.
Right. They rely on microtransactions and sheer retention. They give you the first few episodes for free, hooking you with this crazy, dramatic cliffhanger, and then you pay 10 or 20 cents to unlock the next 60-second hit.
It compresses the setup, conflict, and resolution of a traditional story into this rapid-fire dopamine loop.
And the actual physical production of these microdramas is an exercise in extreme efficiency. The thesis paints a vivid picture of how scrappy this is. We're talking about production companies operating out of old, abandoned Hollywood office spaces.
Well, like I mentioned at the start.
Yeah. They operate on brutal 8-day production cycles. The crews are working 12-hour days, shooting 11 to 15 script pages a single day.
To put that in context for you listening, that is triple the output of a standard Hollywood sitcom. Triple.
It is raw, unadulterated production. There are no unions slowing down the workflow. There are no massive catering budgets, and certainly no luxury trailers for A-list talent.
It honestly reminds me of a perfectly engineered fast food burger.
A burger. Okay, I'm listening.
Think about the mechanics of it. A fast food burger is cheap to produce. It relies on foundational formulas, salt, fat, and sugar, that have satisfied human cravings for thousands of years. It completely bypasses the bloated, pretentious fine dining experience of a legacy Hollywood that has basically forgotten how to cook a decent meal.
Wow, yeah.
You might not get a Michelin star narrative experience, but you get exactly what you paid for immediately, and it hits the spot.
That analogy perfectly captures the underlying threat to legacy media, because this multi-billion-dollar microdrama boom proves unequivocally that the audience is still there and they are willing to spend money.
The demand for stories is alive and well.
Yes. It is the legacy supply chain that is broken.
So if we synthesize all of these arguments we've talked about today,
Right.
What is the ultimate warning for the entertainment industry?
The synthesis is that nature abhors a vacuum. If Hollywood refuses to swallow its pride, if it refuses to go back to the basics of structural screenwriting and run like an agile, lean business focused strictly on entertaining its target demographic, it won't just continue to lose money.
It'll die.
It will be entirely replaced. If traditional American studios won't provide unpretentious, high-quality entertainment, massive foreign markets like Japan and Korea are already stepping in to fill that void. And if traditional long-form formats continue to alienate viewers, these scrappy, tech-based microdrama competitors will happily capture the audience's attention and their wallets.
It is a ruthless market correction in real time. To bring it all together, the core narrative we've explored today argues that Hollywood's current crisis is a potent, toxic mix.
Yeah.
You have massive economic bloat meeting an ideological echo chamber.
Yeah.
This echo chamber alienated its core demographic, and now the industry is displaying a stubborn unwillingness to adapt to a landscape where scrappy competitors are doing it cheaper, faster, and with a much sharper understanding of what the audience actually wants.
Now, you might be listening to this and thinking, wait, I actually really like that new superhero movie, or I don't mind the new direction of these franchises, and that is entirely valid.
Oh, absolutely.
The perspective we've outlined today isn't about invalidating individual taste. It's about macroeconomics, structural bloat, and mass audience retention over time. But if we step back and look at why this matters to you, the listener, it comes down to agency. As consumers, you hold the ultimate power in this equation.
You vote with your wallet.
Exactly. The entertainment industry may seem like a massive, untouchable monolith, but it relies entirely on your voluntary participation. Every view on a streaming platform, every theater ticket bought, and importantly, every canceled streaming service is a financial vote. You are actively reshaping a multi-billion-dollar industry based on where you choose to spend your attention.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating, provocative thought to mull over. We've talked about the massive bloat of traditional studios, and we've explored the scrappy hyper-efficiency of these one-minute microdramas. But let's project that trajectory 10 years into the future. If attention spans continue to shrink, and these tech-based formats refine their algorithms even further, could we see a near future where artificial intelligence and independent creators completely bypass the traditional Hollywood distribution model altogether?
It's entirely possible.
Could legacy studios become entirely obsolete?
Yeah.
Not necessarily because of these intense cultural debates over identity, but simply because they are crushed by the raw, algorithmic efficiency of decentralized storytelling.
It's a huge question.
It's a wild possibility to consider. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the media you consume, keep voting with your attention, and we'll catch you next time. Because at the end of the day, it's your streaming bill, and you deserve to know exactly what you're paying for.